Welcome to episode 16 of Echoes of Curiosity, my friends. I am so glad you're with me. I am excited to record this episode. Without a doubt, it's going to be a long episode. But I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're spending a little time with me here today. The last episode was heavy. There's no way around that. But it was also deeply healing for me in a very personal way. And, as I was honoring the memory of my parents in that episode, something in me said, I want to talk more about them. I want to talk more about my parents, about Marge and Bill Boylan. Mom passed away in 2018. Dad, he had passed away a few years before that, 2013. They raised 5 children, and I'm the youngest of the bunch. So, yeah. They married in 1953. But what's fascinating and what I really want to explore today is how remarkable their lives were before they were married, before they ever became a couple, before they started raising a family. But before I begin, I want to say something. I want to say something very clearly. There are gaps in this story. Not because anything was hidden, and not because I'm choosing to leave things out, but for the simple fact that my parents came from a generation that lived their lives quietly and privately. And that generation didn't cultivate the habit of introspection. That's something that's a little bit more of a recent phenomenon with my generation. They shared stories that they wanted to share, and all the rest just simply lived inside of them. I'd say my father told more stories than my mother, but even so, there's so much I don't know, and I'll never know. So what I'm sharing today is the story I do have, the pieces they offered, the moments they revealed, and the history that I've pieced together over the years. And I'll just say this, it's incomplete, but it's true. And I think it's enough to honor who they were before they became mom and dad. So, welcome to this journey. This is going to be fun. It's going to be nice. My mother, her name Marge, was born on April the 8th of 1923. In the final months of the Harding administration, she was born into a lively Depression-era household that would eventually include 6 children. And I say Depression era, with full awareness that the Depression actually didn't technically start until 1929, but all of my mom's formative years were during the Depression, during the Great Depression, and my father as well. She arrived as part of a fraternal twin with her sister Mary, and we would all come to know Mary later as Bow, my Aunt Bow. Their mother, Mary Rose, and their father, John Morosky, were raising a large family in a world where privacy was scarce. The resources were thin, and resilience was just part of the daily life. The home was full of noise and responsibility and the strength that comes from being one child among many. I think it was a childhood shaped more by circumstance than introspection. The kind of life that teaches you to work hard, stay steady, just to keep moving. My father was born in 1925, and he started life in a rural stretch outside of Kane, Pennsylvania. This is the kind of place where the roads were long and interspersed with fields and farms and forest and just long stretches of nothingness. There was no school for 40 miles. As the oldest of 5 kids, he grew up between 2 very different worlds. So there was this busy, noisy house where his mother, Catherine, was raising babies, one right after the other, and this rural setting. And there was the quiet, orderly home of his grandmother, Lucy, who insisted that he live with her so he could actually get to school in town. His father, Clarence, worked, and the reason why they lived so far out, his father worked long hours in the oil fields. So Dad didn't see him much. But through that time, my father had one steady fascination, and it was airplanes. And I mean, really think about that for a second. When Dad was a little boy, seeing an airplane wasn't just unusual. It was something almost magical. The Wright brothers' first flight was only a couple of decades earlier. So spotting something in the sky with wings was like witnessing the future before it arrived. And Dad would spend hours outside just watching the sky, hoping one of those rare airplanes might pass overhead. And he told me once when I was interviewing him, and this was later in his life when he was suffering with dementia, so I got that story in bits and pieces, but he'd say, my head was always in the clouds. I always had my head in the clouds. And honestly, even as a small boy, he already knew he wanted to fly. When Dad was 8, he was called home and told his father was dying of polio. His last memory of Clarence was, his last memory of Clarence alive was seeing him confined to an iron lung. Soon after that, he was made to kneel before his father's body, his father's lifeless body, laid out in the family parlor. And Dad, at 8, thinking about this, 8, he was told to lead the rosary. I'm sure it was through tears that he didn't really understand. When it was over, he was taken back to his grandmother's house where he would live apart from his mother and his siblings for years. So that's how life began for this little boy who always dreamed of the sky and of airplanes. Mom, by contrast, she grew up as a twin, and in many ways she lived in her sister's light. She told me about a moment from her early childhood, a moment that stayed with her for decades. She overheard her own mother say to a neighbor woman who was talking in another room, "Bao is the pretty one." Imagine that. She was just a little girl, but the words landed hard. I think that shaped into a quiet ache that she carried into adulthood In this household of 6 children, she learned early to be steady and practical. She didn't talk much about her youth, but that was something that I will say I learned much more about when I was her caregiver in later years. You know, she wrote me a lot of letters when I lived in Texas. I was living in Texas for 27 some odd years, and I saved a lot of communication from Mom. She wrote me faithfully back in the days when folks wrote letters, you know, and I will say that she rarely wrote about her youth, but she did express so much tenderness, and these letters she used to send me, she worried about me. She always reminded me to take care of myself, and I think all of that came from that little girl who at one time felt unseen. So yeah, her childhood wasn't really defined by stories. It was more defined by feeling. Bao, her beauty was undeniable, and in a small town, you know, beauty carried weight. My mother, by contrast, she grew up with protruding teeth, almost what would have been probably considered buck teeth, but not quite too protruding. But I mean, they were noticeable. So a childhood nickname clung to her. They called her Bucky. They called her Bucky, and the twins were known as Bucky and Bao. Bucky and Bao, and that pairing, it made, I don't know, I guess it made this comparison pretty impossible to escape. And she, in addition to that, she also had slightly deformed thumbs. And this was not a severe deformity, but it was enough to make her self-conscious. In photographs, and you can see so many of these photographs from her youth, she hid her hands, curling her thumbs inward, and she would do the same thing in social settings. So she was self-conscious about those things. And even Bao's beauty would be drawing attention, you know, Mom's strength, I think, showed up in other areas. So one of those areas would have been academically. She excelled. She did. She found confidence in that realm, and she did receive praise in that area. So I think in a way her intelligence became her anchor and a place where she did feel seen. So it was a quiet kind of inward pride, even though pride was also frowned upon in those days. You know, you just did not get too proud of yourself. You didn't want to become you didn't want to be perceived as arrogant or proud. Bao and my mom were opposites in temperament as well. According to my mom, Bao was outspoken, and she was sometimes spoiled. And she would test the limits of their mother's patience. And Mary, you know, my grandmother, she was raised in very strict conditions and traditions of the Polish and German immigrant parents that she had. They believed in discipline, and she didn't hesitate to enforce it. So one day, according to Mom, this was during a heated exchange, and I don't know much more about, you know, how it all started. Those details have long since faded. But Bao challenged her mother with a sharp, defiant, "Well, who are you?" kind of thing. And Mary's hand rose in anger. And my mother, who was clearly, she was protective even as a child, she stepped between them. And the blow meant for Bao struck my mom instead. The wedding ring on Mary's finger shattered one of my mom's front teeth. So this was an accident that left a permanent mark um, to an already existing kind of tooth situation for my mom with the the protruding front teeth. Now she had one that was broken, and that dental injury followed her into adulthood. But what stayed with her even more was the moment itself, her instinct to protect her twin, and this complicated love that was expressed by a mother whose strength sometimes came with unintended harm. Conversations with my mom when we lived in Richmond together, when I was her caregiver, um, that was a great time, and a good time for me to learn so many things that I never knew about my mom. We were living side by side, and we were sharing conversations and navigating tenderness and aging and memory together. Those are conversations I still cherish. Those the kind of conversations that happen when, I don't know, when life slows down enough to let the truth surface. Those shared pieces of her early years that she had carried silently for decades. When my mother was 12, she woke in the middle of the night with a pain so sharp she couldn't stand. And her family didn't yet own a vehicle, so her brother Mickey carried her down the steep steps of their hillside home to a neighbor's vehicle that was waiting below. The town doctor, who was summoned in haste, arrived drunk, a fact her mother Mary noticed immediately. Mary instructed, when they got to the hospital in Ridgeway, this town about 7 miles from Johnsonburg, she instructed the attending physician to stay at that doctor's side throughout the surgery. The appendix was removed, and the crisis passed, and my mother recovered over the next several days. But when she returned home, Mary decided it was time to break her daughter's fingernail chewing habit. She told Mom that her appendix was full of fingernails. This was a story my mother believed so completely that she never chewed her nails again. So this was the kind of love that Mary practiced. Mary Rose. She was fierce, she was protective, and she just delivered it all with equal parts of authority and imagination, clearly. And another factor of my mom's upbringing was that she was raised in an immigrant household shaped by two languages. Mary was the American-born daughter of Polish and German immigrants, and she spoke English and Polish fluently. But her father, John, spoke almost exclusively Polish. At home, at the paper mill where he worked, and the men in his community, many Polish immigrants. It wasn't necessary to learn English to do that kind of work. The younger children, my mom included, never fully learned the language. So they grew up hearing emotion without meaning. There was tone, but no context. These were conversations that belonged to the adults alone. And it gave her a lifelong sensitivity to mood, I think, to silence. And it meant her childhood lived partly in the spaces between worlds. Even in pictures, in photos, the contrast between the twins is unmistakable. Bao carried her beauty with an easy confidence. She was expressive, and she was outgoing, very quick to smile. And my mother had a softer presence, I mean, truly, they were both beautiful. Um, but Mom's smile was always a little bit more gentle, I guess. Her posture was always slightly inward, and her hands were very often hidden to conceal those small thumb deformities. So in those childhood portraits, she looked thoughtful. She looked sensitive, and she looked observant. In their graduation photo, Bao's pose was playful and assured, while my mother's was modest and introspective. They were bonded, but they were shaped by different gifts. You know, my Aunt Bao's beauty and boldness, and my mom's intelligence and emotional depth. These differences followed them throughout their lives. And that pretty much formed the emotional landscape of their twinhood. My father was still just a boy when his world and the larger world changed. He worked part-time at his uncle's service station, helping to support his widowed mother. He did whatever he could to ease the weight that she carried alone. So on a quiet Sunday afternoon, he slipped into a new car model displayed in the showroom. And for him, you know, he had these little small moments of escape. He he turned on the radio of the car expecting music, and the broadcast was interrupted. Pearl Harbor had been bombed. The country was at war. And he sat there in the stillness of that car, the hum of that garage around him, and he felt something just ignite inside of him. His lifelong dream of flying, that dream that he carried since childhood, suddenly just aligned with a purpose bigger, larger than himself. He knew in that instant that he was going to fly. He knew what he was meant to do. Later that same year, the superintendent announced at his school, he announced a pre-flight program for students who had hoped to enter the Air Corps. The Air Corps was what the Air Force was called at that time. It was the opportunity he'd been waiting for. But when he applied, he was told he didn't qualify, that he hadn't taken plane geometry. And I guess most boys would have accepted that, but he didn't. He asked if he could take a half year of geometry and then jump straight into trigonometry. Something in his determination must have moved them, because they agreed. And his senior year became a gauntlet. Physics, advanced math, every subject he needed to pass in order to graduate and qualify. He had never studied so hard in his life. He told me he was not an A student by any means. In fact, he was, academically, he wasn't so good. But he never studied that hard in his entire life. And even though he didn't graduate with honors, he did graduate. He earned this chance. He turned 18 on March 26 of 1943 and immediately signed up for the draft. His induction notice arrived on April the 15th, but because he was still in school, he requested a deferment to finish his education, and he graduated on May 30th. So by June 15th, his second notice arrived, and by that time, he had already applied for the Air Cadets. The written exam he had to take was difficult as well, but that grueling work of his senior year paid off. He passed. He took his physical, and on June 21st, he left home for the Air Corps. The way Dad told it, Air Cadets was the West Point of the Air Corps. It was a year and a half of relentless training. discipline, pressure. But Dad loved it. He he expressed in one of his letters to me that he ate flying, he slept flying, he lived flying. In December of 1944, at 19 years of age, he received his wings and his commission as an officer. Yeah, he was with a lot of other guys who were spending the money that they got on nights out and little luxuries. But Dad wasn't doing any of that. He was sending all of his money home to his mom. He felt like that was his duty. And that was the same duty that had shaped him since his boyhood. He was essentially the man of the house. I guess it's lucky for all of his children that the war came and went while he was in training. So he never saw combat. In December of 1945, he was transferred to Westover Field in Massachusetts, where they gave him a choice. He could remain in the Air Corps or he could return home. He was 20, and his words, he was a hotshot pilot, and he had no idea what civilian life would hold. But it was December, and Christmas was coming, home was calling, so he chose discharge. The dream he had of flying had been fulfilled, but there was a new chapter waiting to begin. After graduating high school in 1940, my mother, she didn't rush into adulthood. She stayed there in the tiny town of Johnsonburg and worked a series of small jobs. She helped her Aunt Sarah, who owned a restaurant and soda shop. I'm sure that she went on a few dates because that's what young women were expected to do. But they also were expected to find a mate, settle down, follow that typical path. But she wasn't ready. She was still growing into herself and still carrying some of those insecurities from her childhood. And I think she was beginning to figure out who she was apart from Bao, apart from that twin identity that had shaped her earlier years. For a while she did. She stayed close to home and she earned modest wages. But the world was changing, the war was intensifying, and then her Uncle Carl, who had moved to Chicago, which was a city that must have seemed enormous compared to Johnsonburg, he wrote with a suggestion that she get on a train and go to Chicago. There were jobs for women there, good jobs, steady pay. There was a chance to earn real money and be part of the national effort. He didn't just encourage her, he encouraged her and her younger sister Kay to come. So they were on a train for Chicago in 1943 together. They were stepping into this world side by side. They stayed with their Uncle Carl and his wife Irene, and because everyone in that house worked some kind of wartime job, the whole place felt plugged in to this city's, Chicago's industrial heartbeat. I mean, Chicago was truly an industrial city in the 40s, no doubt about it. And there was a converted Pullman railroad car manufacturing factory, and it had been repurposed for the war. There were no longer railroad cars being manufactured. They were manufacturing aircraft parts. So the years of 1943 and 1944 were years that my mother worked in that factory, along with Kay, as what would become known as Rosie the Riveters. And I think for my mom, who had grown up feeling self-conscious about her appearance, factory work was offering something different. So this was a place where skill mattered more than beauty, and showing up and doing a job well meant something. So it's interesting to think about this. Without even realizing it, my mother was helping build the very airplanes my father would one day fly. So their wartime paths were already running parallel many years before they met. The Chicago years did give my mother and Kay work, but it gave them something they had never really known before, which was real money, real wages. After years of the scarcity during those Depression years, the pay for this Pullman factory felt almost surreal. It's like, what are we getting here? We're getting money that I remember Aunt Kay once describing this. We were flush with cash. we had so much money, and the thing is that they had to send the majority of that money back home to Mary. She insisted that they send that because, well, for one thing, their father's hours had been cut back at the paper mill due to wartime restrictions and so forth. And even so, they had more money and held more money in their hands than it ever had before. They bought clothes, they went to movies, to restaurants, and they even paid for expensive studio portraits, these glamorous photographs that captured them as confident young women stepping into adulthood. Now, I should go ahead and get this photo now because it sits there behind me, and I want to show it to you. So I'm gonna put this mic down for just a second and grab it. I'm going to hold it back a little bit so you can see. But this picture of my mom, I have to say, is by far my favorite of all the pictures of her. And this was that studio portrait that was taken in Chicago while she was working in the factory. And there's an interesting little side story to that picture too. She did not like the photographer. According to her, and again, remember, Mom was still a good Catholic girl. She recalled that he kept telling her to jut her breasts out more, and she felt that was inappropriate. So the guy was kind of lecherous in her mind. So they spent money. They bought what they could buy, but within those limits, they found joy. It wasn't all work, but the work was hard, and they carried it with pride. By 1944, I'd say Chicago had changed her. This was no longer a shy girl from Johnsonburg. She'd really kind of morphed into an independent and capable young woman, and beautiful in a way she had never fully recognized in herself. So this was it. That was 1944, and by 1945 the war was ended. My father, for him, the decision to return to Kane was not really simple, but he felt obligation. He was the oldest son. He's the one that stepped into his role of the head of the family when his father died. And he had to take care of his mom. His mother was widowed. She hadn't yet met the man who would become her next husband. He had been sending money all along, and now he had a chance to to take care of her, and his younger siblings were drifting, so he felt a responsibility that never really left him, even during the war. He he chose discharge, but it was a difficult choice. He did have, I mean, his dream didn't end. He had a real dream to become a commercial pilot, but putting this in perspective, after the war, there that was what all these young men were. Those who were pilots in during the war, they were clamoring for these jobs in the burgeoning new commercial air travel industry. So that's an interesting thing. Dad wasn't able to pursue. To his disappointment, he did try. He applied to be a commercial pilot. He just did not succeed there. So he went to work for the railroads. He worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad, and he began transporting mail for that company. And eventually, he would move on up to the position of railroad clerk. Mom, after the war, she moved to New York City, where she worked as a stenographer for a book publishing company, Little Brown and Company, in the Singer Building. And this was an incredible, no longer extant building in New York City that had once been the tallest building in the world. It was a Beaux-Arts skyscraper. And each morning she left the grit of the Lower East Side where she was living in this little apartment, and she'd step into this marble lobby lined with bronze railings and high ceilings, where 16 elevators carried her and hundreds of other workers to narrow tower floors with sweeping views over lower Manhattan. Imagine, just it must have been a thrilling place to work. She worked with editors and literary types, and she was there in the hum of that city's literary life. I would think for a young woman from Johnsonburg, this work at the Singer Building must have been a world of elegance and ambition. She didn't live alone. She, again, was with Kay, her sister Kay. They had this Lower East Side apartment, and they shared it with a childhood friend named Phyllis, also from Johnsonburg. The rent was high for what the place offered. There were cramped rooms and thin walls. It was a noisy immigrant neighborhood full of tenements, and but the fact that they split the cost made it possible. And this, again, thinking about post-war New York City, I'm thinking, we talk about a housing shortage now, but imagine after the war, all these servicemen and women poured into New York City and needed places to live. So there was a housing crisis then as well. It was hard to find a place that was affordable. So in the evenings, these girls returned to their shared space. They worked in different offices, all of them, and they traded stories at the end of the day, and just created a little home in that pocket of this gritty neighborhood. But it was a chapter of independence and companionship and discovery. So New York wasn't just a place my mom lived. It was the world she stepped into. She made friends at work with other women that were navigating the city. They went to movies. They caught plays when they could afford them. They enjoyed cocktail hours in smoky lounges after long days at the office. And, Mom didn't really speak of this to me, but I'm certain that she dated The city was full of returning veterans and young professionals that were, eager to build lives after the war. But Manhattan in the late 40s was a bustling, crowded place, and it was alive. My mom was part of that pulse. Those years shaped her. They gave her independence and confidence, and I think a sense of herself that she would carry into the life she eventually did build with my father. There's an interesting side story here that I'd like to share. I have this book. This book is a book that my mother kept all her life, and I have it. I'm glad to have it in my possession. But it's called The Sword of Il Grande, and it's signed by its author, Will Creed, and inscribed to my mom. And the inscription wasn't romantic. It's not romantic, but it's a warm note, that's wishing her well. But, this was one of the things that revealed something she never spoke about directly, but she moved through New York as a young woman, and she formed connections and friendships, and I'm sure some quiet flirtations that she kept to herself. And to me, this signed book is a small artifact of that world. And that's just a reminder that before she became my mother, she was a bright and appealing young woman living in post-war Manhattan. So life in this Lower East Side was exciting, but it wasn't safe. One night, while my mom and Kay and their friend Phyllis were out, their apartment was burglarized. Hearing my mom tell this, they didn't own any real valuables, and the thieves ended up stealing nothing but their underwear. And my mom would remember this with equal parts of humor and unease. The violation shook them as it should have, so that they left. And I think it was within probably weeks, if I remember correctly. She and Kay left Manhattan for Freeport, Long Island, and then from there they would commute to the city by train. They stayed and moved in with their sister Bernice, whose home with her husband Carol and their two young children were an offer of safety and steadiness, and they needed that to continue working. So the New York years for Mom weren't shaped just by the city, but by the women who stood beside her. There's a photo from around this time of these four sisters, Kay, Bao, my mother, and Bernice, and I think it just captures the strength of their bond. They were a constellation. They were a beautiful assemblage of siblings. Mom and Kay were enticed by Mary to return to Johnsonburg because Mary and their father had just bought a brand new Chevy, and Mary said, if you come back, we'll take a road trip to California. So they did. They returned, and in that time that they were waiting to take this road trip, which was a whole other story. It was a long road trip with a month spent in Texas, where Bernice and her husband Carol would eventually move to Dallas. And this is an interesting detour that they did. And Mom, in the interim, started dating this guy named Ed, and Ed and she eventually became engaged. And I'll tell you the rest of that story in just a second. But there was this really wonderful photo album that her sister Kay composed and made, and just something stunning, with all of these pictures from this California road trip. And in one of the pictures, while they're in Dallas, Mom is seated and knitting something. And I know when I lived with her and took care of her, I was going through those pictures with her, and I asked, Mom, what are you doing in this picture? And she's like, I'm knitting socks for Ed, the guy that she was engaged to. Well, Mom broke that engagement soon after the return back to Johnsonburg. Seems that Ed wanted something that Mom wasn't willing to give him, which was to put out. She never used those words, but again, she was still a good Catholic girl, and that wasn't in her purview. So she was a single woman again. So meanwhile, my dad was working in Kane, and working in Johnsonburg. He was living in Kane, and he was hitchhiking to Johnsonburg, to the train station there, where he ended up working as a clerk at the Johnsonburg station. Well, this is interesting, and it's a sad part of the story here. This a day came along where Dad and a friend of his went out. This was a day, or an evening, I should say, where my father's life changed really dramatically. It was a late November night, and this is a kind of cold November night in northwestern Pennsylvania, very typical, very, very cold. And he and his friend Jim had driven into Kane for an evening at the Arlington Hotel. This well-known hotel had a little club inside the hotel called the Birdcage. Really interesting name. And this was a place where you could drink and dance and just enjoy camaraderie with other people who worked long hours and just wanted to kick back and let loose and enjoy a night on the town. So sometime late in the evening, they met these two young women from the tiny village of Wilcox, which was about, it was a few miles south of Kane. And it was well past 2 a.m. when Jim and my father drove them back on these long stretches of unlit roads, dark roads, in the cold. And according to the Kane Republican, which was the newspaper of that town, this accident occurred 3 miles south of the town. My father was a passenger, and Jim was driving. At some point on that stretch, the car went over an embankment 45 feet down and crashed. There were no seatbelts. My father was thrown violently inside the vehicle. Jim fared better. When he reached my father and tried to move him, my dad was, no way, no, I am hurt bad. You need to go get help. And my father was, indeed, he was hurt very bad. Jim climbed the embankment in the freezing dark and went for help, and my father was left there drifting in and out of consciousness inside that wrecked car. There's no way to know exactly how long he laid there in that cold. And an ambulance did eventually arrive and took him to the hospital in Kane. So the diagnosis was severe. He had a fractured dislocation of the fifth vertebrae in his neck. And within 24 hours, he was transported to Erie for specialized care. That is where he met Dr. Clayton Wilmot Fortune. Dr. Fortune was a Canadian who had graduated from the University of Toronto Medical School and trained in orthopedics at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. He had settled in Erie years earlier and served at the Shriners Hospital, but by 1950 he would become chief of the new orthopedics department at Hammett. So my father, my 25-year-old father, was going to be operated on by this man, Dr. Fortune. When I was interviewing my dad a few years before his death, he again was in the throes of dementia, but he was able to piece together for me some important information from this time. And one of those pieces of information involved a nurse a retired nurse, now retired nurse, who lived in Johnsonburg, who was an attending nurse to Dr. Fortune there in Erie. And he suggested I call her to get some background or some information about Dr. Fortune. And I did have a phone conversation with this nurse, and she remembered my father very fondly. She said he was a very good patient. But about Dr. Fortune, she said he swore like a truck driver and was a perfectionist. But he was extremely skilled. He was very well known in the medical establishment, and Dad was indeed fortunate to have Dr. Fortune. He explained what he needed to do to my father, and it was none of it was pleasant. Of course, it was painful. He said, "I'm going to operate on your neck, and it has to be local anesthesia. We can't put you under completely." And he told Dad that his job was to find out what happened. So he was going to cut open the back of his neck, and at the same time, his assisting surgeon, Dr. Giuliano, would be operating on his leg. So yeah, that surgery was grueling, and the recovery even more so. My father spent months in a full body cast. I mean, full body cast. He was immobilized. He was dependent. And it was a slow and stubborn bit of work he had to do to heal. Keep in mind, this accident happened in November. That cast was not removed until mid-June. So, yeah, it was a very trying time, but he did heal. He did walk again. The possibility that there could have been a lifetime of paralysis is just stunning to me. But he carried the memory of Dr. Fortune for the rest of his life, and he got a second chance. So when that cast finally came off, he returned to the job that would sustain him and eventually our family for the next 35 years. By 1951, he was working in Johnsonburg, renting a small apartment there from a guy named Harry and his wife. And he walked each day to the train station. Yeah, this accident had changed him. And he admitted it made him look at life differently. His social world was pretty simple. He joined the Elks Club, the local Elks Club. There were card games, drinks with other locals. And he felt home at Johnsonburg. He really did. It felt friendly to him. And he was glad to call it home. Mom was working at an insurance agency in town, and because the mail still went out on the train, she'd often come down to the station, and his recollection was that she was friendly. So he asked her to a dance at the Elks. She agreed, and there were more dances. There were more dates, and they grew close. And within a little over a year, they were engaged. 2 lives. shaped by hardship and chance. They finally found each other. You know, as I look back on these two lives that were separate for a very long time and unfolded each in their own way, shaped by history and circumstance, I'm reminded of something simple and true. My parents' early years were never puzzles to be solved. They were landscapes. Landscapes I inherited in fragments. A story told in pieces. History is carried in silence. And those truths that they revealed in moments that they chose to share. That's the story I've told today. And it's enough. I'll see you next time, my friends.